I honestly thought I was doing everything right with my soil, watering it, feeding it, fixing the same patch over and over again the way most gardeners do. Like it was a habit more than a plan. But there was one spot in the garden that kept confusing me. No matter what I added, it stayed weak, tired looking, like nothing I was doing was reaching whatever the actual problem was. Then I tried something almost embarrassingly small, just a pinch of a cheap black powder mixed into the soil around a few plants. I wasn't optimistic about it, curious, maybe, but not hopeful. A few weeks later, I noticed the soil behaving differently, not the plants, not yet. The soil itself, water wasn't running straight through the way it usually did in that patch. It was staying longer, not pooling, just holding. The texture felt looser when I checked it by hand. That's what made me slow down because I had spent a lot of time looking at what was growing above the surface. This was the first time I started paying attention to what was happening underneath it. If you've ever had a patch of ground that seems to resist everything you try, you might want to stick around for this one. Most gardeners will recognize this problem instantly. You look at certain soil and you just know it's going to struggle. Too light, too sandy, too dry, or sometimes the opposite, dense and compacted, where roots seem to give up before they've properly started. The kind of ground where you're always adjusting compost in fertilizer, in watering routines revised, and still the same tired result the following season. I used to assume that was just how gardening worked. You improve soil, it degrades, and you improve it again. A cycle that never really closes. But then I noticed something inconsistent in my own beds. There was a section that had underperformed for 2 seasons running. No obvious disease, no pest pressure. It just didn't produce the way nearby beds did. I'd already written it off as structurally poor soil, the kind you work around rather than fix. After adding the powder, I expected maybe a marginal improvement, if anything at all. What I got instead was quieter than that, but harder to dismiss. The soil in that patch started holding moisture in a way I hadn't seen there before. Not wet, just stable. It wasn't swinging between bone dry and oversaturated the way it had been. It held a kind of middle state that felt more forgiving. At first, I blamed the timing. Maybe I'd watered back that week. Maybe the weather was more consistent. I told myself not to read too much into one observation. But then I started comparing it to nearby beds that hadn't been treated, saw them watering, same weather, different behavior. That's a harder thing to dismiss. There are places where old growing ground seems to behave differently from what the soil condition would suggest. I'd heard this described by a few growers over the years, usually in passing, without much explanation. Patches of land that had been cultivated for a long time, sometimes for generations, that seemed less reactive to poor weather, less stressed by dry spells, less dependent on constant input. My first assumption was better composting history. Someone had put serious organic matter into the ground years back, and it was still paying off. That's a reasonable explanation, and it might be partly true, but I kept running into the same description from people in completely different climates, growing different crops, with no shared composting tradition to point to. That's when the pattern started feeling like something other than luck. Why does it matter? Because most of us think of soil fertility as something we have to keep feeding to maintain. The moment you stop adding inputs, it slowly declines back toward baseline. But in certain cases, not everywhere. Not always the ground seems to hold its improved state longer than that model would predict. That's not a miracle. It's a question: what exactly is holding that change in place? I didn't arrive at an answer quickly. And honestly, I'm still not certain. I have the full picture, but I did start noticing something in my own soil that pointed in a consistent direction. The improvement wasn't just showing up in plant growth, it was showing up in how the soil was physically organized. When I watered, the surface didn't crust over the same way. When I pushed roots down into a transplant hole, the soil didn't close tightly against them. Air pockets seemed to persist longer. And when I pulled a plant up to check its roots, they were spreading outward more evenly instead of circling and compressing. These aren't dramatic observations. They're the kind of thing you notice after years of handling soil regularly, the difference between ground that feels alive and ground that feels inert. Here's a rough way to think about what might be happening structurally. Ordinary organic matter compost, mulch, aged manure breaks down relatively quickly. It feeds the soil's microbial population, improves moisture retention short term, and contributes nutrients as it decomposes, all genuinely useful. But by design, it cycles through months, sometimes a single season, certain carbon based materials. And this is where the black powder becomes relevant. Don't behave the same way. Some forms of carbon are extremely stable, not chemically inert, but structurally persistent. They don't break down on the same timeline that organic matter does. When they're incorporated into soil, they don't disappear after a season. They stay. And while they're staying, they appear to influence how water moves through the soil, how air distributes through the particle structure, and how microbial life organizes itself around those stable surfaces. This isn't a new observation. Farmers in different parts of the world have worked with this kind of material for a long time, though they didn't always call it the same thing or understand the mechanism the same way. Some came to it through tradition, some through accident, some through the same frustrating trial and error I found myself in. What consistently showed up across those different contexts was a similar pattern. The soil's behavior seemed to shift in a way that lasted longer than most inputs do. Here's what tripped me up early on, and I suspect it trips up a lot of gardeners. I treated the powder like a fertilizer. Mix it in, water it down, wait for results. And when I didn't see obvious changes above the soil within a few weeks, I almost moved on. That was the wrong expectation. A fertilizer delivers something directly nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and plants respond quickly because they're receiving something they can immediately use. The response is visible. It's fast. It's the kind of feedback that makes you feel like you did something right. This isn't that. What I was observing instead was something slower. The soil was changing how it held itself together. That's not a process that shows up in a single watering cycle. It shows up over weeks across multiple conditions. When you start comparing behavior rather than appearance, I noticed it first in how the soil responded to heat. During a stretch of warm, dry days, the treated patch didn't stress the same way. The untreated beds nearby started showing that familiar light surface crust, the kind that signals moisture is leaving faster than it's being replaced. The treated patch didn't develop that crust at the same rate, a small difference. But it compounds because if your soil holds moisture just a bit longer during a dry spell, your plants have a slightly longer buffer before they begin to show stress. And if that happens consistently across a season, the cumulative effect on root development can be significant even if no single day looked dramatic. That's the kind of change that's easy to miss if you're only watching for it in the short term. I also made the mistake of adding too much in one section, thinking more would produce better results. It didn't. The soil in that spot became harder to read. The response was muddled. I couldn't tell what I was seeing anymore. Looking back, that was impatience more than anything else. More is not always the variable that matters. What surprised me most over time wasn't the change itself. It was that the change didn't fade the way I expected it to. Most things I add to my garden have a shelf life. Compost is gone by the following spring. Liquid feeds last a few weeks at best. Even well incorporated organic matter has a cycle you can follow if you pay attention. This behaved differently. The structural change I described, the looser texture, the slower moisture loss, the more even root spread, wasn't reverting. It wasn't fading back toward baseline the way most inputs do. If anything, it seemed to be incrementally reinforcing itself. Part of that might be biological. Stable carbon material gives soil microbes a surface to colonize and a structure to work around. Over time, that microbial activity may itself contribute to improved soil aggregation, the way particles clump together into the kind of structure that lets water move efficiently without simply draining away. So, the change you introduce may help create conditions for further natural change, not guaranteed, not linear, and certainly not dramatic, but observationally consistent. I want to be careful not to overstate this. I'm working with one garden in one climate over a few seasons. That's not a study. It's a set of observations, and observations have limits. What I can say is that the patch I treated with that cheap black powder now behaves differently from how it did before. The difference isn't spectacular, but it's stable in a way that's unusual for something I put into soil without much expectation. And that's what kept me thinking about it longer than I expected to. What I eventually settled on is a fairly simple framing, though it took a while to get there. Some soil improvements work, like temporary injections. They give the soil something it needs right now: nutrients, water, microbial food, and the effect diminishes as those inputs are consumed or washed away. Other changes work, more like structural adjustments. They alter how the soil is organized rather than what it currently contains. And because structure tends to persist longer than supply, those changes behave differently over time. The black powder I used appears to be more in the second category. It doesn't feed the soil in the conventional sense. It changes the physical framework the soil operates within, and that framework sticks around. This isn't useful for impatient gardening. If you need a quick response, a visible burst of growth, a fast correction for a nutrient deficiency, this isn't where you look. But if you have a patch of ground that keeps underperforming despite regular inputs, and you're starting to wonder whether the problem isn't what's in the soil, but how the soil is structured, then this is worth thinking about differently. The slow changes are the ones most gardeners overlook, not because they're harder to notice, but because we're trained to look for the fast ones. Pay attention to what the soil does between your interventions. That's usually where the real picture is forming. The observations described here reflect one gardener's personal experience with a specific soil amendment over multiple growing seasons, result in different soil types, climates, and growing conditions may vary. If you're working with a particular amendment, it's worth consulting regional horticultural resources for guidance suited to your specific conditions.